Welcome to the channel. Lonnie, the unwitting witness featured in this story, didn't become a ufologist. He didn't go on talk shows and theorize. But he did see a strange object. New Mexico. April, 1964. The desert radiated heat, like a huge sleeping animal that sweltered under the sun and refused to wake up. The air hung heavy with the smell of dust and gasoline, dry tumbleweeds rolled along the sides of the road, and beyond the horizon, where the mountains looked as if they were cut from cardboard, the sun was preparing to set. The town of Socorro. Small, almost forgotten by God and man. A few streets, a couple of gas stations, a church, a police station with a peeling sign. Life here flowed slowly, quietly, without surprises. People knew each other by name and could tell by the sound of an engine who was driving past their house. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora, a man already in his 30s, with short-cropped hair and a face that bore the marks of constant weariness. He was neither a hero nor a dreamer. He was one of those who just did their job. Every morning he put on his uniform, checked his radio, got into his patrol car, and drove the roads where almost nothing ever happened. He loved order. He loved it when everything was explainable. People in Socorro knew, if your fence was broken or someone was making noise at night, call Lonnie. He'd come, he'd take care of it, he wouldn't raise his voice. He wasn't one to say too much. Once, before joining the force, he worked as a mechanic. He knew how to fix engines, how an overheated engine sounded, how burnt oil smelled. He understood cars better than people. He had a wife, Mary. A kind, quiet woman who baked pies for the neighbors and always waited for him with dinner. They lived modestly, a small house with a white porch, an old television, a couple of framed photographs. They had no children, but their home still felt warm. In the evenings, Lonnie liked to sit by the window, watching the sun drop behind the hills. Drinking coffee and keeping silent. Sometimes Mary would ask, "What are you thinking about, Lonnie?" He'd usually just shrug. "Nothing, Mary. Just, the sky." He had always loved the sky. The blue, dry, bottomless New Mexico sky. So vast that a person beneath it felt small, but not insignificant, just a part of something bigger. For several weeks before that day, talk had been circulating in town. People said they'd seen some flashes on the horizon. Some said it was the military conducting tests. Others, that it was falling meteors. But Lonnie didn't believe rumors. He was a man for whom everything happened for a reason. If something glowed in the sky, it was either a reflection or smoke from the White Sands Proving Ground, which was located nearby. When the radio talked about UFOs in the 1960s, he would just chuckle. People love fairy tales, he once told a colleague at the station. They're bored with life, so they make up stories about someone coming to get them. His colleague, a young guy named Sam Chavez, just nodded. "What if they ever come for you, Lonnie?" "Well, then they'd better show me their license and insurance," the sergeant replied dryly, and both laughed. Nobody knew that in a few days, the joke would become prophetic. That day was Saturday, April 24th. His shift started as usual. The sun was especially hot, the air wavered with mirages. Lonnie checked his patrol car, a white and blue Plymouth, buckled his seatbelt, checked his notebook, radio, and pistol. "God be with me," he mumbled under his breath, and drove off. On the road, he thought about little things, about Mary wanting to go visit her sister that evening, about his brakes squeaking, about it being time to replace a light bulb at the station. Nothing hinted at the fact that this day would be talked about for decades. 532, over. We have a report of a traffic violator, a white Chevrolet, heading south. Copy that, Zamora replied. He hit the gas. A cloud of dust billowed up behind the car. A minute later, he already saw a tiny dot ahead, the glint of a white hood. We'll catch him now, he muttered, habitually figuring out where to intercept him. But at that moment, something happened that ripped him from his routine. First, a sound. A dull, low rumble, unlike an engine roar or an explosion. It seemed to pass through the ground, hitting him in the chest. Then, a light. Orange-blue, dazzling, as if someone had melted the sky. Lonnie instinctively slowed down and cursed. What the hell? On the horizon, where the hilly area beyond town began, he saw something. A bright burst of flame, and smoke that rose upwards. For a second, he thought a tanker had exploded somewhere. He grabbed the radio. This is Zamora. Looks like a fire or an accident. I'm going to check it out. He turned off the highway, driving down a dirt road leading toward an old quarry site. The wheels squeaked over the sand, dust obscured the windshield. His thoughts raced frantically. Maybe a plane crashed. Maybe someone had set the grass on fire. He turned on his siren to warn others he was approaching. A couple of minutes later, the road suddenly dipped down, and a small, dried-up streambed opened up before him. Below, behind the hill, smoke was still billowing. Lonnie cut the engine, got out of the car. Silence. Only the wind and the buzzing of cicadas. He squinted, shading his eyes from the sun with his hand. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the gulch stood an object. Metallic, silvery white, in the shape of an oval egg. Not large, maybe 16 feet long and 10 feet high. The surface gleamed like polished steel, and slightly shimmered with heat. And next to it, two figures. Small figures in white suits, bent over, as if fixing something at the base of the craft. Lonnie froze. He thought, workers, maybe military personnel. But the suits didn't look like uniforms. And their height was no more than 5 feet. One of them, it seemed, turned its head. The officer's heart pounded louder. He wanted to yell, "Police!" But his throat went dry. And at that moment, one of the creatures straightened up abruptly, and seemingly vanished behind the hull. The next thing that happened, a sound. The same rumble he'd heard before, but now, right above him, getting louder, getting closer. The air vibrated, the sand beneath his feet trembled. Lonnie instinctively ducked, covering his face with his hands. Flames erupted from beneath the craft, blue with a white center. Dust swirled in a vortex, bushes ignited. A second later, the object rose, smoothly, almost without a jolt, a few feet, then abruptly accelerated and vanished behind the hills. Silence returned, as if nothing had happened. He stood, stunned, and only heard his own breathing. The air smelled of char. On the ground, where the object had stood, remained 4 indentations, as if from massive supports. The surrounding bushes were scorched, the sand fused together. Lonnie pulled out his notebook. His hand was trembling. He wrote, "Oval-shaped object. White. No windows. 2 creatures in white suits. Vertical takeoff. Noise and flame. Landing left traces. He looked up. The sky was serene once more. And only one word kept circling in his head: why? That evening, he still didn't know that his name, the name of a simple sergeant from Socorro, would become one of the most cited in the history of ufology. He didn't know that his quiet life ended at the very moment the sky above the desert flared with blue flame. He just stood in the hot wind, feeling his knees tremble, and trying to convince himself that it was all real. The sun was setting behind the hills as Sergeant Lonnie Zamora stood alone in the middle of the desert. Before him was a scorched circle of ground, for impressions, and slowly cooling bushes. It smelled like after a thunderstorm, metallic air, ozone, and fear. He pulled out his radio. 532 calling dispatch. A pause. Go ahead. What do you got, Lonnie? Replied the familiar voice of the dispatcher. I've got. He hesitated. The fire's out. But I need someone sent out. Tell Chavez to get out here. He looked at the ground again. The tracks were regular, even. For indentations, as if an object had stood on supports. Lonnie knelt down, touched the sand, warm, almost hot. A gray residue was left on his fingers. He was a practical man, but even he understood, no tanker, no truck could have left such marks. The wind ruffled his shirt, the heat of the sun was fading fast, and Lonnie felt himself starting to tremble. Not from cold, but from the realization of what he had seen. 10 minutes later, a dusty Ford appeared. Out of it stepped Officer Sam Chavez, the very man Lonnie had recently joked with about UFOs. So, what do you got here, buddy? He said, walking closer, but the smile quickly dropped from his face when he saw the scorched circle. Did you set this on fire? No. I just got here myself. It flew away. It? Zamora gave him a long look. I don't know what it was, Sam. But I saw it rise up and disappear. Chavez squatted down, puzzled, and ran his hand over the sand. Warm, he muttered. And the smell, damn it, like metal. He straightened up and looked at his friend. Lonnie, are you sure you're not mistaken? Zamora shook his head. I wish I were. They stood over the spot where, just minutes ago, something that couldn't possibly be had occurred. The sun was already touching the horizon, the sky turning copper, and long shadows stretched across the scorched ground. By the time they got back to the station, it was almost 8 in the evening. The radio crackled with the city's routine evening calls, normal domestic issues, someone lost a dog, a light was out somewhere. But in Lonnie's head, only one hum resonated, the same one he'd heard in the desert. The station smelled of coffee and paper. A clock ticked on the wall. The duty lieutenant, an older man with graying temples, looked up as they entered. Well, how was your day? He asked lazily. Zamora was silent. Chavez answered for him. We need to write a report. Serious incident. As Lonnie began to tell his story, the room seemed to shrink. He spoke briefly, in an even voice, as if dictating a report, though his insides were churning. I saw a light, bright, blue. I thought it was an explosion. I drove up. I found a metallic object. White. On the ground. About 5 meters long. What kind of object? The lieutenant interrupted. I don't know. No wheels, no wings. Just a hull. He swallowed, then continued, 2 figures were standing next to it. Small, in white suits. When I drove closer, they disappeared. Then, a flash, a sound, flames. And the object rose. Silence hung in the room. The lieutenant rubbed the bridge of his nose. Are you sure you didn't see a test craft from the range? Maybe the military was launching something. If they were, Lonnie replied, then someone needs to tell them they're burning up the desert near the city. No drunks out there, added one of the duty officers with a slight smirk. Zamora looked up sharply. I'm not drunk. His tone was so firm that even the lieutenant faltered. A couple of hours later, the station received a call from the county. They'd already heard about the incident. Some local farmers had seen a flash, some had heard a strange sound. A commission was expected the next morning. When Lonnie left the station, the city was already asleep. The streets were empty, streetlights crackled with insects. He walked home, not feeling tired. Stars twinkled in the sky. He stopped, looked up, and suddenly felt something he'd never felt before, unease. Not fear, but a feeling that someone, somewhere, was looking back. Mary was waiting for him by the window. You're late, she said. What happened? He didn't answer right away. He took off his hat, wiped his forehead. Just a strange day. She walked over and placed her hand on his shoulder. Something serious? He nodded. We'll find out tomorrow. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, that blue flame flashed before him. The next morning, 2 men in plain clothes arrived in Socorro. One introduced himself, Captain Richard Holder, an Army officer. And this is Agent Bernice Frost, Air Force. We're here about yesterday's incident. They arrived in a Chevy Bel Air, stern-faced, with notebooks and cameras. Lonnie drove them to the landing site. The sun was already up, but the ground there still smelled of char. Holder walked around the circle, knelt, and touched the sand. Warm. It's cooled down now, Zamora replied. Agent Frost took out a Geiger counter. The device clicked softly, but the needle barely moved. Clear, he said. The smell's still there, Holder remarked. Smells like burnt metal. They photographed everything, the impressions from the supports, the scorched bushes, the cracks in the sand. 3 meters between the marks, Holder noted. Perfect symmetry. Lonnie, he asked, are you sure you saw 2? Yes. Small. In white suits. I thought they were children, but when I got closer, I knew they weren't. And you didn't hear them speak? No. Only a hum. Holder wrote something in his notebook, then exchanged a look with the agent. Interesting. Throughout the day, reporters began to arrive at the scene. Dusty cars, cameras, tape recorders. Socorro police see UFO. Headlines blazed in the newspapers within 24 hours. Lonnie hated it. He didn't want to be part of the show. When reporters tried to interview him, he walked away, waving them off. I said everything in the report. That evening, Holder approached him. Listen, Sergeant. We haven't found an explanation. So, something crashed. Possibly. But officially, we're calling it an unidentified object for now. He gave a wry smile. That sounds worse than it was. Holder shrugged. Sometimes the truth doesn't always fit in a report. A week passed. Rumors grew. Some said it was a NASA capsule, others that Zamora had simply seen a mirage. But some swore they'd also heard that hum, seen the flash. Letters started arriving at Zamora's house. Some with support, "You're a brave man, stay strong." Others mocking him, another one who saw little green men. He tried to ignore them, but irritation grew inside him. Not because they didn't believe him, but because he himself couldn't explain what he had seen. Every time he returned to that spot, he felt the same strange feeling, as if something was alive beneath the earth. Not fear, not anticipation, but a questioning silence. One evening, he met Chavez again. They sat by the police station, drinking coffee. "So," Chavez said, "did anyone believe you?" Holder said officially it's unknown. Unknown, Chavez smirked. Sounds fancy. Yeah. Doesn't make me feel any better though. Lonnie looked at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the desert red. He was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "If that really was something not from here, then we don't even understand how small we are." Night fell over Socorro again. The city slept. Lonnie lay in the darkness, listening to an old weather vane chime somewhere in the yard. Holder's words echoed in his head, "Sometimes the truth doesn't always fit in a report." He closed his eyes, and again that blue flame flashed before him, the shadow of two figures, and the strange feeling that they hadn't flown away. They had simply gone somewhere he couldn't see them anymore. The spring of 1964 in Socorro was hot and dry. The streets smelled of dust and gasoline, and vultures circled lazily in the sky. And at the police station on the corner of Paseo del Norte, the phone was ringing off the hook, reporters, military personnel, some scientists from the East Coast. Everyone wanted to ask the same question: what had Sergeant Lonnie Zamora actually seen? After the initial publications, the story spread like wildfire across the country. Newspapers called him the witness of the century, radio hosts scoffed, and television sent film crews. Some declared him a hero, others a fantasist. But Lonnie himself had already started avoiding people by that point. He arrived at the station earlier than anyone else and left last. Work saved him from his thoughts, but not for long. Every shift now began with jokes. "Hey, Sergeant, if you see a UFO, don't forget to get an autograph." He didn't get angry. He just didn't respond. On the third day after the incident, Major Hector Quintanilla, head of Project Blue Book, arrived in town. He didn't like journalists and didn't believe in miracles. In his world, everything had an explanation, it just wasn't always obvious. When he entered the sheriff's office, he saw a tired man in a faded uniform who didn't lift his eyes. This was Zamora. Quintanilla studied him like an experimental subject. He had seen hundreds of such witnesses, farmers, pilots, housewives. But this one was different. He showed no desire for fame. There wasn't even an attempt to convince. He simply recounted what he had seen. Without embellishment, without drama. And that's what bothered Quintanilla the most. He went to the scene of the incident himself. The heat beat down on his head, the sand reflected the light like a mirror. The landing gear marks were still visible. Scorched grass, a perfect circle, and strange rocks, melted to a sheen. Everything looked too precise, too real to be a hoax. Over the following weeks, the report on the Socorro case grew page by page. Military engineers suggested it was an experimental NASA module. Astronomers spoke of ball lightning. Skeptics claimed Zamora might have been the victim of a prank by students from the New Mexico Institute of Technology. But when these students were questioned, not one could provide evidence. Blue Book checked everything: time, wind direction, airplane flights, radar signals. Nothing. Not a single object was detected in the Socorro area that evening. There were no launches, no accidents, not even a thunderstorm. Nothingness. For a Project Blue Book report, this was a rarity. Of the thousands of cases in the project's history, most were quickly closed: a mistaken observation, the planet Venus, a meteor, headlight reflections. Meanwhile, Lonnie became increasingly withdrawn. He didn't like attention, didn't seek fame, and now felt as if his life no longer belonged to him. Every evening, unfamiliar cars parked outside his house. People waited for him to come out, say something, show them the spot where the craft had landed. Sometimes strangers called him, whispering that the truth would soon be revealed, or, conversely, that he'd better keep quiet. He began to avoid conversations about what had happened. Even at home. Mary tried to keep the conversation going, but he would just withdraw into silence. He couldn't explain what he had seen, even to himself. And perhaps that tormented him more than all the ridicule. A few months after the incident, in early autumn, the military reappeared in Socorro. They brought equipment, took soil samples, and photographed the remaining earth. Some of these photos later vanished from the archives. Rumors circulated that they were confiscated after analysis showed anomalous temperature readings and microdamage to quartz particles, as if the sand had undergone brief melting at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees. But officially, this was not reported. The report stated, traces are consistent with the effect of a jet source of unknown type. Quintanilla was displeased. He believed the case should be closed. But everything concerning Socorro defied logic. Not a single person could point to the source of a hoax. Not a single instrument showed radiation. No witness, other than Zamora, saw the object itself, but dozens heard a hum, saw a flash. And deep down, even Quintanilla began to doubt. In Washington at the time, Project Blue Book was in its final years. Public interest in UFOs was at its peak, the press demanded answers, while the Air Force wanted silence. Zamora's case became an unwelcome example of how official science cannot explain the obvious. One of the analysts would later write in the report, "If all UFO witnesses were as reliable as Zamora, the question of the phenomenon's existence would be resolved." These words never reached the press. They remained in the archives, classified as official use only. Meanwhile, Lonnie's life continued as usual. He remained on duty but rarely responded to calls. The town gradually got used to it, and new residents of Socorro knew him simply as that police officer. Children pointed at him as he drove by. He smiled at them, politely, joylessly. Sometimes in the evenings, he would still drive out of town to that very spot. He would stand where the earth had once glowed and look at the sky. The desert had long since grown over with grass, the wind had erased the traces, but he still saw before him that white craft and two small figures. Sometimes it seemed he could even hear them, a faint whistle, like the wind, and a soft crackling in the air. He never told anyone about this. Years passed. Project Blue Book closed in 1969. All materials were transferred to the Air Force archives. The Socorro case remained unexplained. Lonnie Zamora retired from the force shortly after that. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, attended no conferences. When asked about that day, he would only reply, "I saw what I saw. There's nothing more to add." In the Blue Book archives, there is a photograph. It shows a man in uniform, pointing to the scorched circle. On his face, neither fear nor elation. Only weariness. This photograph became a symbol of one of the most enigmatic stories in 20th century ufology. But if you look closely at this man's eyes, you can notice something strange. Not fear. Not doubt. Rather, understanding. As if he knows a little more than he lets on. And knows that it's too late to speak. Socorro today is a small, quiet town. Dusty streets, sparse signs, the old police station where a copy of Zamora's report is still kept. At the landing site of that object stands a sign. Here, on April 24, 1964, Sergeant Lonnie Zamora observed something that remains unexplained. Tourists come, take photos, and move on. Locals smile, our little Roswell. But those born here know, that day changed the town. Since then, the night sky over Socorro never seemed like just a sky to them. Lonnie Zamora died in 2009. To the end of his life, he never changed his testimony. He didn't seek fame, didn't try to prove he was right. He simply lived as he always had, quietly, honestly, dutifully. But in his final years, according to his loved ones, he would sometimes go out into the yard at night and stare at the stars for a long time. Not like a man searching for an answer, but like one who already knows, yet cannot explain it in words. Somewhere out there, over the New Mexico desert, the stars burn just as they did that night in 1964. And perhaps, some of them are looking down too. At the man in uniform, who once saw the impossible, and could never forget it. The New Mexico desert leaves no tracks. It lives by its own rules, scorching by day, freezing by night, and washing away everything from the day before by morning. But if you stand where Lonnie Zamora once stood, you can feel a strange sensation, as if time itself breathes beneath your feet. More than half a century has passed since then. The world has become different, faster, louder, more technological. But the story of the sergeant from small Socorro still hasn't lost its power. It has become a myth. And in every myth, there's something more than just a fact. Some researchers believe that the mystery of Socorro is a mirror. It reflects not UFOs, not aliens, not the secrets of technology, but humanity itself, with its ability to believe and doubt simultaneously. Lonnie Zamora was no dreamer. He wasn't looking for miracles. He was a man who lived by the rules. He knew the value of hard work, duty, and keeping his word. That's why his account still sends shivers down your spine. If a man like that says he saw the impossible, then the impossible suddenly becomes real. The Socorro story isn't about what landed in the desert. It's about what awakened within us back then. The human mind is structured to always seek boundaries. We build cities, conquer the sky, fly to the stars, but we still fear the darkness beyond the window. We fear that in that darkness, there's someone looking back. And sometimes, perhaps very rarely, it really does look back. When the investigations concluded, reports were filed away, scientists forgot, and journalists moved on to other topics. But for one man, it didn't end. For him, that evening remained etched on the film of memory, a frame forever imprinted. He didn't need proof, it was enough for him to know that it happened. It's said that a few years before his death, Zamora told a priest he no longer prayed for understanding of that event. He simply prayed for peace. And perhaps, that is true wisdom, to accept the mystery without trying to unravel it. If someone could ask him now, decades later, what did you see back then, he would probably answer simply, something that doesn't belong to our world, but isn't against it either. Something that just was. And in that lies everything. The New Mexico desert looks the same today as it did back then, dust, sparse bushes, hot air shimmering over the ground. Sometimes tourists come there, to look at the marker, take a photo, tell friends about the real UFO spot. But if you stay there alone, without cameras, without words, it becomes clear why Lonnie Zamora could never forget that day. There's something alive in that silence. It doesn't frighten you, it listens. As if the desert is waiting for someone to witness again what once happened here. Each generation chooses its own mysteries. For some, it was the desert and flying saucers. For others, black holes, artificial intelligence, the search for life in the depths of space. But, essentially, it's all the same, we still look up and ask, who's there? The answer, perhaps, will never come. Because, maybe, the question itself is more important. As long as we ask, we remain human. If you listen closely, you might hear a faint ringing, as if, somewhere far off, that hum Zamora heard in 1964 has started up again. And perhaps, it's not the echo of an engine, nor the sound of fire, but simply a reverberation of man once touching the unfathomable. The desert erased everything. But not memory. It remained, not in reports, not in archives, but in those who once heard this story and felt that same strange feeling, a slight chill under their skin, and a question that doesn't demand an answer. Lonnie Zamora's story isn't about what he saw. It's about what we are capable of seeing. The world will always be full of shadows and light, and sometimes, something flickers between them that needs no explanation. And perhaps, that is the truth.